There's a story told about a brother and sister, ages 8 and 10, who were constantly getting into trouble. To the parents, it seemed that if there were any reports of mischief going on in the neighborhood or at school, their two children are at the heart of it. The parents tried everything they knew to change their behavior, but nothing worked. And then the parents heard that one of the pastors in town was quite well known for his ability to discipline children and help them change their behavior. So in desperation, they contacted him, and he agreed to meet with the children, but only one at a time. He asked to see them separately, so the girl went first. The pastor sat the girl down in his office and asked her sternly, "Where is God?" The girl's jaw dropped, but she said nothing. So the pastor repeated the question in an even more forceful manner. "Where is God?" Her eyes were now wide like saucers, and she was shaking, but she didn't say a word. So the pastor raised the voice even more and said, "Where is God?" Like a shot, she was out of the chair. She ran all the way home, up the stairs, and hid into her closet. Her brother, seeing this, entered the closet and asked what was going on. She replied, "We're in big trouble this time. They don't know where God is, and they think we had something to do with it." Where is God? This question is one of the questions that the community of John's Gospel is wrestling with at that time. And the answer to that question lays at the heart of our Gospel passage. For John's interpretation of what has commonly become referred to as Jesus cleansed the temple reflects the author's understanding of where God is to be found. For although all four Gospels offer this story, there are striking differences between John's account and of the other three synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and Mark. And the differences, the details, are important to our understanding of what John is attempting to get across. For the authors of Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke place the story of Jesus running the merchants and the money changers out of the temple as one of Jesus' last public acts. It happens immediately after Palm Sunday, when the crowds have been waving palms and shouting Hosanna as he parades on a donkey into the city. Setting it there in this way, Jesus' actions serve as the last straw leading to his arrest and execution by the Romans. However, in John's Gospel, it is the action of raising Lazarus from the dead that serves that final straw purpose. For John puts the cleaning of the temple at the beginning of his Gospel as one of Jesus' first public acts. Another difference between the account in John and the account in Synoptics is the charge that Jesus makes as he runs the cattle and sheep out of the temple. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus objects that they have turned the temple court into a den of robbers, a place of corruption that is robbing the people who are coming to worship. But in John's telling, Jesus' complaint is that they have turned the place into a market. And there's sort of an irony in that statement. The answer that they could have given Jesus at that time was, well, of course we have. Or at least we must have it contain a marketplace. We couldn't practice our temple rituals here without it. The market there was necessary for two reasons. First, the money changers were necessary, for Roman currency depicted the emperor as a god, and for the Jewish people to use those coins within the temple would have been tantamount to breaking the commandment of not to make graven images. Since the only place that Jewish currency could be accepted was in the temple, there had to be a place for the people as they came to worship to change from the Roman currency to the Jewish and then back to Romans before they left. The second reason was that Jesus does this is for the reason he drives the cattle and the doves. It's needed to have those animals there, for at this time Jerusalem is a bustling city, and many pilgrims come from far distances in order to worship at the time of festivals. And so for those worshipers, these animals were necessary to participate in the rituals and the practices of worship at the temple. So if these practices are to remain as a way for people to come to relate to God, then the temple must have a marketplace available. Jesus isn't making a complaint against consumerism here. But even before he gets into that conflict over what authority he has undertaken these actions, Jesus has declared that the current temple system is dismantled. But for many people of Jesus' day, the significance of the temple goes far beyond a place to come to worship. It was the place where God has taken up residence among them, the location where God fulfills the promise to be present and to love them forever. It was the place they went to celebrate and remember God's actions throughout their history, freeing them from slavery in Egypt, leading them in cloud and pillar through the Exodus, and returning them to their nation after their exile in Babylon. Going to the temple and the rituals such as the festival of the Passover that surrounded it were not merely religious duties to be fulfilled. They embodied the reality of God's presence and love shown in actual moments of the people's lives together. Jesus' actions in the temple expanded this location. If this isn't clear through the placement of the event and the impetus of Jesus' actions that are given by John, John emphasizes this again when Jesus declares that he is now the embodiment of God's presence. He is where God now resides. Now, Jesus was hardly alone in the Jewish religion of his time to press for a different interpretation of what the temple meant in Jewish life. The Pharisees themselves argued that God resided actually in the Torah, in the practice of the commandments and of the law given to Moses. And by the time of the Gospel of John's writing, it was a moot point, for the temple was a thing of the past, destroyed by the Romans while quelling an attempted revolt in Jerusalem in the year 70. So the community of John is part of an overall Jewish religious discussion and a struggle at that time on how does one relate to God without the existence of the temple? How does one be in this relationship where we can't go to where God resides? As one scholar states, where one looks for God, expects to find God, imagines God to be, are all at stake in the Gospel of John. John's answer is that in Jesus, God is right here, right in front of you. And even in the second chapter, this is not a new claim to John's Gospel. The prologue contains the heart of John's theology, that the incarnation of God in humanity is the Word. The Word has become flesh and dwells among us. Or as Eugene Peterson paraphrases it, the Word becomes flesh and moves into the neighborhood. For John, the destruction of the temple doesn't mean that God has abandoned the people. In fact, John is telling his community that even before his destruction, even before the temple was destroyed, the Word had become flesh and moved into the neighborhood of humanity. It is the reassurance that God's presence isn't found only or even primarily in the temple. It's a reassurance that the temple's destruction doesn't mean that God has taken up residence away from them. Instead, God has expanded God's neighborhood so that you can encounter God and remind people that they have been encountering God throughout their lives, out in the world and in each other. Jesus becomes another embodiment of God's love and presence in their history and in their world. And that is good news to John's community that is struggling with where to find God in their world. And it remains good news for us today. Whenever we ask, where is God? This passage tells us that the answer is, and always has been, in our neighborhood. God is in the midst of all of God's children, bringing grace and peace no matter where or how we worship. God is found in the midst of that relationship with God's children, that relationship that God has had with Abraham and Sarah, with the people in the Exodus as God leads them through the desert and resides with them at night in the tabernacle, as God helps them to build that nation of Israel, and as God continues today. God is found in that relationship with God's children, in all the faith communities, and all their different understandings and expressions. Rather than narrow down where God is found, Jesus expands their understanding. For to paraphrase Peterson's paraphrase, God has expanded the neighborhood where we can go to recognize that God is among us. And even today, as we gather in our churches, as we have buildings in which we can come and worship, that continues to be good news indeed. C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, he gives a great illustration of where we can find God. You might recall from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that 4 children from England travel through a magic wardrobe and end up in the land of Narnia, where with the great lion Aslan, who for Lewis is a Christ figure, helps defeat the witch that keeps Narnia in perpetual winter. When they return, it is the last time that the oldest 2 can come back. But over the next 2 books, Lucy and Edward continue to come and join Aslan and their adventures there. But at the end of the 3rd book, as Aslan leaves them to go back to England, to their world, Lucy asks, "When will we be coming back again to see you?" And Aslan, the great lion, responds, "You will not be coming back again. This is your last time here." Lucy is devastated. She cries, "Then how will we ever see you again? How will we ever know you? Aslan replies, you will see me in your world, but I won't look like this. The whole purpose of bringing you to Narnia was so that you could get to know me, so that when you return to your own world, you could recognize our encounters there. Where and how we worship are not the means by which God draws closer to us. Rather, they are ways that God uses in a variety of ways and understandings that we can come, spend some time with God, and then recognize our encounters with God out in the world and with each other. May you recognize those encounters this week.